or gifts of land to the monastic community, which include these coastal landscapes. Other diachronic changes, we've got them in both avian and mammal signatures. So the key transitions in terms of bird exploitation, much heavier emphasis on domestic birds in the monastic phase archaeology, up to sort of 30% of the total animal bone assemblages. And wild birds, as a proportion of the overall bird assemblage, decline. So more of an emphasis on wild birds in that earlier phase. In terms of domestic animals, clear transitions again. Pig in the 6th to 7th century is way up near the 50% mark, and most zooarchaeologists would agree in this period that's a high status indicator. We're looking at a feast food, and this fits in very nicely with what we know about the exploitation of wheeled dens for pannage, for pig husbandry. As you move into the Middle Saxon phases, the monastic phase, sheep-goat really takes off, and this fits in well with our broader understanding of the specialisation of wool husbandry at that period, of which monastic sites appear to have played a sort of a key role. Cow is broadly similar in the two phases. So what our archaeology has established is that there are all these key diachronic changes in economy and daily life taking place over the occupation sequence. And we're able to demonstrate that particularly clearly because there is this spatial shift that I talked about. We haven't got contamination from earlier deposits that can complicate interpretation, which is nice. So, just working towards a conclusion, let's just summarise then the narrative that we've been able to establish through our work at Lyminge. So we appear to have two distinct settlement foci. The earlier, dating from the 5th century into the early middle 7th, which culminates in the establishment of our Great Hall complex. Remembering that it is to be the case that this is imposed a particular period, probably at the beginning of the very end or very early part of the 7th century, in this ancestral settlement that dates back to the 5th century. Then we appear to have a localised Middle Saxon shift, so things switch round. We get the movement of abandonment of that earlier settlement, a move to that new ridge-top locale with the monastic nucleus established at the end of it in this very prominent position. And that's accompanied by a series of transitions in lifestyle. We get much tighter spatial organisation of the settlement at this period, boundary definition, the zoning of different activities is quite clear from the archaeology. We get a greater diversification in terms of the structures represented. So we get service structures, latrine pits, rubbish pits, storage pits of various types that aren't attested in our earlier settlement focus, certainly not to the degree they are in the 8th and 9th centuries. And new forms of production and consumption, exploiting new interrelationships with the wider world and the territories beyond, which would have provisioned the central place and monastic community of Lyminge. So that's the picture that's been produced from work since 2007 up to 2012. It remains for me to just kind of outline what the work that remains to be done. This is a geophysical plot. Again, I have to thank David Thornley for producing this fantastic map of the underground archaeology. 2012's excavation was just off the summit of this site, 30 metres square, just here. What that geophysic plot tells us is that there are several other sunken featured buildings located in this locale, Some configured buildings that most likely represent more of that early settlement focus that I talked about. We've so far excavated in totality one major hall, but what we know from other sites is that these typically form part of broader complexes. We expect other major timber structures. My guess is that right on the plateau, where we'll be excavating this summer, there'll be something akin to what we found last year there. One of the key unknowns and question marks that we want to target in the coming year are what appears to be a major double boundary defining the southern portion of this, this space here that kind of follows the contours of the spur above the River Nailbourne. Now, I haven't mentioned some of the other, well, I've made a brief mention of the Mesolithic archaeology that we found here. What I didn't mention, and Granville will be particularly disappointed at this, is that we've also found lots of major Saxo-Norman occupation focus on the same site dating to the 11th and 12th centuries. The thing is that we do have these major boundaries. We need to date them, it's quite important. They could belong to the same phase as our Anglo-Saxon hall complex. They may be later, but it's absolutely fundamental to actually place them within our sequence. So I think we decided on that basis to do a little bit of a thirtling at the last week of the Easter holidays, and a few of us are just going to go down and excavate a trench across this double boundary feature. Whatever the case in terms of that, what happens to that boundary, there still remains major Anglo-Saxon archaeology on this site. And I'm sure further revelations of the type that I've talked about in the last hour or so. So it's very much watch this space. I hope that many of you will be able to visit the excavations in progress this July and August, and indeed the students out there, I hope you can take part and you'll be applying for one of our bursaries. Just to say, if you want to keep updated on the project, and I put the website there, Simon and Alex have been integrally involved in the launch of a new public website. So previously we've had the academic website under the archaeology departmental pages, but we've got a new sexy website that looks a bit like this. Well, this is actually one of the pages from it. It's designed as a portal really for everybody to use. It's got links with the very hugely successful site blog that Alex produced last year, and some of the other kind of outreach events. We've got a travelling exhibition that's touring Kent at the moment with exhibits from previous excavations. So it's all going to be going up on this website here. So I encourage you to check it out, and if you're interested in taking part, just update. This is where our updates are going to happen. So that's it. Thank you very much for listening. Cheers.
So, question, not on the Mesolithic, let's keep it entirely to the Anglo-Saxon. Who'd like to start?
When you refer to that settlement shift, Gabor, which you called the Middle Saxon shift, normally we think of that in terms of a shift of settlement of similar status sites. I mean, here you're arguing for a major functional change in the process of shifting.
In the sense that it becomes religious and monastic.
Yeah. And do you see any possibility that there is a period of coexistence between the two sides?
Yeah, I mean that's a question that I've certainly asked myself, and that's where the radiocarbon dates are going to be absolutely key. What I can say is there's no evidence for any Middle Saxon activity on the site of the hall and down the lower parts of the the village that we sampled in 2010 and 12. And I mentioned those clear contrasts in the character of the archaeology as well. You know, the incidents of these, you know, rock-cut pits on the Anglo-Saxon settlement, which are not happening down in that earlier focus. So, I mean, it may be that further excavation, you know, will change the picture, that will establish that there is a period of overlap. But on the evidence that we've got so far, I'll be inclined to say that we're looking at something that's rather more sequential. One replaces the other. But
so that does mean that we have to revisit this issue about the relationship between royal sites and monastic sites.
Yeah.
In that period, and how you were presenting the model at the start may have to be modified quite a lot, doesn't it? Does it imply that this arrangement of royal estates in Kent may actually be failing by the 7th century?
That's a possibility. So what you're actually looking at is that if establishing monastic communities in a way revitalising something that's dying a death. That's a very interesting perspective.
Because some people see royal sites as essentially a support mechanism for the birth of the monastic sites, don't they?
Yeah. I mean, I think one thing that comes across very strongly from our archaeology, I mean, you may argue that Kent is distinct and unusual, is that royal centres, there's clear evidence here for success and stability, long-term stability for royal centres prior to the period of Christianisation. And that conflicts with people like John Blair, who argue that these are, up to that period, that they're very transitory establishments. Clearly they're very successful and long-lived. We've got all the evidence for that high-status activity, economic consumption, right from the latter part of the 5th century.
Who'd like to go next? All right.
Far away, yeah.
Can we go from the beginning to the end now? I mean, you're saying that the monastic sequence you've got appears to end in the 9th century.
Yeah.
Yeah. But you have some Saxo-Norman stuff in a totally different place.
Yeah.
In the 11th century, on the 11th century.
Yeah.
So, are you tempted to argue that the monastery is actually failing?
Yeah.
In the 9th century?
Yeah. We know from historical documents that many of the Kentish minsters and monasteries are hit fairly drastically by Viking raiding in the 9th century. We've got a wonderful early 9th century charter that records the monastic community at Lyminge being given a refuge within Canterbury, within the walled circuit of Canterbury. So we know that they were directly affected. Now, one of the big questions is then what happens beyond that period to these places that were formerly independent institutions, with shrines and so forth. What the archaeology does appear to show is that there is indeed a demise in the fortunes of this place. And it may be that what we're seeing in the Saxo-Norman activity is again a later period of revitalisation when it's incorporated within the Archiepiscopal See, and you get, according to the historical sources, Lyminge is run and administered as an estate centre within that later framework. But there does appear to be a sort of a 10th century gap. Now that may be, you could argue, a product of the archaeology, but the possibility exists that it's actually real. That's
really interesting, isn't it? Because people argue that you have quite a profound dislocation of a minster network in the 11th century that you see sometimes mirrored in Doomsday. So your reorganisation into a different ecclesiastical framework might actually fit that scenario.
Yeah.
But very few of the other monasteries in Kent actually go out of use in the 9th century permanently after the Viking raids, don't they?
Well, their character changes because they're absorbed within either St Augustine's or Christ Church. Their ecclesiastical identity must change. Their shrines are incorporated within the major Canterbury institutions. there is a context there for quite important transition in the way that these places function and their role. But we've never previously been able to track any of that archaeologically.
Yeah. Do you want to go for the hat trick? Or? Oh, so you know much more important.
No,
You know about these things.
I might have missed that, but why Lyminge? You said they picked the monasteries for special places, and you have some earlier traces of settlement.
Well, Lyminge is a royal centre. It's a royal ville. It's a place that's intimately associated with the holdings of Kentish royal
So
dynasty.
how did that? Do you think the cemeteries relate to that? Because they
Yeah.
were earlier than that.
Yeah,
Okay,
they're
so
kind of
I missed
leading
that.
up to the establishment of a sort of a formal Kentish kingdom. But what they're saying, but that emerges itself from these earlier lineages that are high status. You know, we're looking at back into the 6th century here, where you've got these powerful lineages that are expressing their status by links with the Frankish continent. Comes through very clearly in the grave goods. You've got this Frankish material culture coming through.
And is there a specific geographic reason why you would sit in Lyminge and not quite much?
Well, it's interesting question, because most of the other minsters and royal centres, many of them are coastal. Lyminge isn't, and I think that makes all the fishbone and the marine evidence that we're finding all the more remarkable. But it may be that you've got these springs. I mentioned the spring head of the River Nailbourne, and that's something that obviously was very attractive to settlement going way back into prehistory. And there may well have been cult and symbolic reasons as well allied to that. So that may be one of the reasons feeding into its long-term significance.
Do you have any late Roman? I'm thinking of comparison with springheads, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
Where you've got the big cult centre at another Kentish river source.
Yeah. That's one of the interesting kind of results, is that it's previously been argued that one of the buildings that Canon Jenkins discovered to the southwest of the tower, that apsidal structure, may have been a Roman bathhouse. What our excavations have shown very clearly is there is no established Roman presence at Lyminge. Yes, we find Roman objects, but they're all curated. Glass, Samian pottery, chosen or selected for particular reasons, and used and pierced coins and so forth. There is certainly a major Roman structure settlement in the vicinity, but it's yet to be discovered.
Other question?
Given the significance of these coastal resources, I mean, is it possible, do you think, that rather than there being one site, that you've actually got two sites with part of your community separately situated on the coast, supplying products to the centre, as it were?
Yeah.
And is there any evidence in later historical times, perhaps, for the use of coastal resources and grazing from communities in the sort of situation that Lyminge is in on Romney Marsh, for instance?
Yeah. I think your point about there being potentially a dependency located out in those coastal margins is a really good one, and we've actually got excellent charter evidence. The site of Santon, which some of you may have heard about, was an estate that was gifted to the monastic community in the 8th century. This is a known site where excavation has taken place in several episodes. There's a great synthesis of that site brought together by Mark Gardner in the Archaeological Journal. So we've got you could imagine that site being a sort of almost like a satellite installation that's taking part. You've got fishing attested there, salt processing, you know this from the charter evidence, and it's also partaking in international trade. So, you know, it may be that there's other Santons out there, but that's one clearly archaeological attested place which appears to be provisioning the monastic centre. Yeah, I mean, there's plenty of historical records that tell us that those coastal marshes were particularly important for grazing, and I'm hoping We have an expert in the audience that's been doing work on coastal marshes and grazing, and the ability to pick that up in the isotopic signatures. There is the potential for, you know, doing work on the sheep bones particularly to try and establish that's where that grazing was happening in Lyminge's case. So you don't look as though you're not committing yourself.
No, it's going to be spectacular.
It's going to be spectacular.
There was another point.
Yeah, sorry, it might be naive, but it was a bit related, really, because obviously if you say that there was 30 or so percentage of fish remains, would you obviously be willing to interpret that as also a sign of Christianization, that simply
yes,
much more?
Silly. I just completely forgot to actually talk about that information. To what extent does this rise in fish consumption and domestic birds reflect the assumption of monastic food regimes? You know, fasting, abstinence from the meat of quadrupeds, and the rest of it that we hear in relation to Benedictine communities and the Benedictine rule. Quite possibly, yes, but the problem is that we don't have assemblages from contemporary secular sites. So, you know, until that happens or we get to that stage, it's impossible to know whether we do have these food regimes in practice in these early double houses, or whether it's a more general reflection of a kind of an aristocratic lifestyle and a diversification of food resources and consumption as an expression of that. So bringing more foods onto the table, hunting and fishing, contributing to that diversification. So I just don't think we're at a stage where you can actually make that link.
I see, because again, I'm not a specialist, but they are trying to make this type of point in Orkney by comparing food assemblages from sites like Broch of Birzai and Egilsai, which is like a monastic site of St. Magnus.
Yeah.
And they do have a higher percentage of fish for Fridays and for other Christian events. So they do try to make that, and I was quite surprised if it's, I don't know limit, but if it's an inland site, there is obviously a lot of effort of bringing that material there. So
yeah, okay. I mean, as you said, you made the point yourself. On Orkney, they can make these interesting comparisons. Unfortunately, at the current stage of understanding, we can't. This very much stands alone, but maybe in the future that would be able to be determined.
Probably time for one more, and we must give you a drink.
Yeah.
Anyone bursting to ask the last question? And it did occur to me, since we've got some of the project team here, is there anyone from the project team who wants to sort of add anything? You don't have to, but rather than sitting here in silence thinking who missed that.
Now that's your chance.
Okay, we interrogate over the wine reception. Well, thanks very much indeed. It's great, one of the best seminars we've had in years. You come from home team. Thank you very much for that. Next week, Fraser Sturt from Southampton University. But for the moment, a big round of applause. Thank you.